Great. So today's topic is Plato and Plato's and the Enneagram and adult development theory. I guess to start it off, I have to say that Plato did not work with the Enneagram, right? There are many ways in which how Plato worked and his thoughts and philosophies actually informed Gurdjieff in a very direct way. Gurdjieff's father was Greek, yeah? So Greek philosophies, deep influence, and we'll start with one of the similarities between Gurdjieff's dense, and sometimes you have to go and scratch quite a lot to go and find the teachings in there, but that was quite deliberate, and Plato's teachings. And then what we're going to do is I'm just going to take you on a little bit of a journey around what Plato's thoughts were, and I'm going to leave you to make some of the connections into the Enneagram. And we'll have some application conversations and breakouts. So that's the broad plan for today. I guess let's just start off with announcements. Our last supervision for the year is 2 weeks from now on the 15th of November. And you really want to come because it's going to be like almost a coaches jamboree. So people from Hart Hill, different parts of the world, some of Jonathan Ream's students from Norway, coaching students, and our community will come together, and Julia will be hosting a conversation. So you can be in conversation with some global students of coaching and global coaches from the UK and Norway as well. So please come. I might be missing out some of Penny Potter's students in the US as well. So just note that that's the plan. It's Julia's session. And then some other announcements. Our upgraded reports will be released 2 weeks from now as well. And they're beautiful. Those of you that have worked with team reports already have a sense of the look and feel. You will be able to download any reports that belong to you, backdated without any cost. Yeah. So know that you will be able to work with the new reports from then. We're very excited about that. And this is a first notice then as well that we're going to have our first price increase since 2019. It's going to be a small price increase in the week of 14 November. We're going to send the notice with the new reports and the price increase together. If you already have units bought up front, that doesn't impact you at all. And you will still be able to buy units at the old price up front. So fill up your account so that it runs in the green until the 31st of January. Okay, so we're giving you 3 months to do something about this. So just look out for that announcement when it comes through with the new report release. And then what stirred the session? Why do I suddenly want to talk about Plato? It's not as though I've been hanging in the Greek philosophy space for most of my life at all. In fact, I do quite well in avoiding some of that. But I've been listening to a series of podcasts by the wonderful John Vervaeke. He's a cognitive psychology professor from Canada, and he has a set of videos, which is altogether about 60 hours that you can listen to, called Awakening to the Meaning Crisis. And he kind of takes you on this journey around different ways in which we, at this point in time as human beings, are struggling with meaning and therefore struggling with a whole lot of other existential issues. And as I was listening to the episode about Plato, there was just something that stirred in me around, let's bring this deliberately in conversation with our Enneagram and our adult development community. So I've popped in the link to the full playlist of 60 hours. If you want to, you can also just go and jump in and out of those episodes if you're interested in his work. And he's done many wonderful sessions together with other thinkers on, well, now, of course, I'm not going to remember, Rebel Wisdom. Sorry, Rebel Wisdom. You can go, and if you're a Rebel Wisdom fan like I am, you can go and listen to some John Vervaeke stuff there. So that's where the session comes from. Now, our opening quotes. Here we go. Plato, from one of Plato's publications, Phaedo, says, meditating on your own death is the duty of practicing philosophy. So to think about, to meditate on your own mortality and your own death is the actual duty of all practicing philosophy. Gurdjieff, in Tales of Beelzebub, says, and this is on the very last page of this book, says the soul means for the saving of the beings of the planet Earth would be that every one of them should constantly sense and be cognizant of the inevitability of his own death. Okay, so there's a direct correlation between some Gurdjieffian thinking and Platonic thinking. And then, of course, when you use our assessments, you are in conversation with this a lot of the time, because one of the sentences you get feedback on is what your clients think about when they die. And then the last piece that I'd bring in is just part of my recent experience, and then I'll pop us into breakouts. So for those of you that have known me for a long time, you know that once a year I go out and do a certain vision fasting process called the Earthlink fast, where Vision Quest guides all over the world go out onto the land on the same 4 days. And we did this again this year from the 1st to the 4th of October. And we had many questions we could take in, because the purpose of that is inevitably you do your own work, but its explicit purpose is to go and listen to the earth, to listen into the field for 4 days while fasting in nature. And of all the preparatory questions that we could take into the mountains, the one that really stuck with me and that ended up being my 4 days of conversation and listening was, what does it look like and to live in the death lodge of civilization? And it was a really interesting, so in the vision fasting work, the idea of the death lodge is that it's a circle that you build deliberately. So this is like a First Nations tradition. You build a circle and you step in deliberately into that circle as a way of practicing your own dying, preparing for your own dying. Who are the people that come to you? What conversations do you need to have? What's your unfinished business? What does it look like to have a good death? And you practice it in the circle, often in an overnight vigil. And for me, the interesting thing when I went out onto the land, I thought, okay, so I'm going to be in conversation with this idea. And then on the 4th day, I'll step into the death lodge and I'll do what we normally do. And what then happened is, as I got to my spot where I was going to spend my 4 days, the rocks just said, well, you want to know what it means to live in the death lodge of civilization, you better live in the death lodge. And so on day 1, I built a circle and I stepped into that. And I was pretty much there, other than my going to tell my stone pile buddies, leaving notes at the post box saying I'm still alive. And I lay in the sun, I lay in the wind, I slept there for 4 days. And it was a very interesting experience because there were so many conversations going on for me. But the one thing one of the many things I came out of that death lodge with was a keen awareness that the way to live in the death lodge and to stay in the death lodge and to not fall asleep in the death lodge, because this is the hardest thing. Like, everything in me wanted to do freeze and wanted to check out all the time, which is, I think, why all our numbing industries are making a lot of money, whether we're talking about sports betting or whether we're talking about alcohol or gambling or entertainment. All of those things are making so much money because it's so much easier to numb ourselves rather than to be awake and conscious inside this time. So much of our way of Western civilization is ending, needing to break in order for something else to happen. And then, of course, ecological breakdown. So that was the one. First, super hard to remain awake, really tempting to just fall asleep. The second thing was that the only way in which one can be in the death lodge is to love everything, which sounds maybe it can sound very superficial, but that experience of saying, what does it mean to love everything, even the stuff that's not just shadow, but blatantly messed up, what does it mean to love everything? And so this experience of saying, okay, my practice right now needs to be to love everything. And it's really hard to stay awake. Is part of what I bring into the conversation together with these quotes by Plato and Greeff. So this is your check-in question. So here's just those quotes from Greeff and Beelzebub, from Tales of Beelzebub and Plato as well. So that informs our check-in questions. We're just going straight for it today, people. What is my relationship with the reality of my own death and mortality? And what aspects of life in 2022 do I avoid the conversation with because of the implications, the anxiety, etc. I know I need to be in more of a conversation, but I'm falling asleep. I'm so tempted to fall asleep. And anything else you need to say to check in today. I'm going to pop these questions into the chat box so you have them, and then I'll pop you into breakouts for 15 minutes. Let me quickly get our check-in questions. Wonderful. Here they go. Brilliant. And off to breakout rooms in a minute. Yeah, that would be good. Great. See you in 15 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Yeah, so let's just maybe harvest one or two insights or thoughts that are floating around in the group right now. You don't have to do feedback of the conversation, but just what struck you, or what's really staying with you. We'll get 2 or 3 inputs. Kate?
It's feeling very close in, this topic. It's feeling very close in. And maybe that comes on the back of COVID and death just being much more close in, right, through this phase of life. But as we age, I mean, there was a lot of talk also of mothers or grandmothers, grandparents approaching death, and us walking that journey with them. Yeah, and a mix of anxiety around that, and some acceptance, and a real leaning in that we just need to lean in more. It feels very close in. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Kate. Yeah, it is close in. And I mean, in the practice of the Death Lodge, part of the philosophy behind that is that we practice our dying to enliven our living. So when we're in a close-in relationship with the topic of death, part of what it enables us to access is a part of our living energy that's maybe more vibrant. So the closer in that is, the more it infuses other aspects of our life. Yeah. And I can feel the tenderness in how you shared that. So thanks. Anyone else who'd like to share?
Okay, in my team, I was sharing with them what I've been recently studying, echoing the word, where we came to a point where eschatology was one of the topics. Eschatology is the theology concerning the last things, of human life, which talks about death, talks about judgment. It talks about hell or heaven. And the fun thing was, after going through that, then it sort of sinked in, you kind of live life as though death is not going to happen, as much as it happens around us every day. So I was saying to them, after doing that chapter, I now went back into the 10 Commandments and check if I'm living, everything orderly so that I at least avoid going to hell. So yeah, this topic is very, very interesting to say. Yes, they are the last things. We can't avoid them, you know. And that's the cycle of life. There's a time for birth and enjoying while it lasts, but death eventually. It's something that we cannot avoid. It's just that as human beings, we kind of live our life being fearful of death as though you'll run away. And I guess the mystery that comes with it is the fact that no one knows when is their day, you know. You are just ready, but you don't know for when. But avoiding or running away from it, unfortunately, is just a lost cause. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Even our tech billionaires building bunkers to avoid the apocalypse will not be able to avoid death. Yeah. So thanks for that, Mumsy. Let's hear one more thought. Anyone else that wants to share something that's salient for you right now? Joe?
So we had a conversation a little bit around how this sort of the aging process and getting closer to death forces us to move away from that focus on external beauty and external looks and external maintenance of being, having your hair blonde and not gray, and being thin and not, with a menopausal belly, and the kind of having to wear glasses and hearing aids and that sort of elderly decrepitude that one starts to approach. But how it forces one to focus on the inner growth, the external dying forces that inner growth. And at what stage do you really just embrace that and spend your time on that rather than on the pursuit of youth, the external pursuit of youth? And what stage you can actually let go of that external beauty and just focus on the inner beauty, and how our society doesn't value that internal beauty as much as we might like it to, especially in the elderly, who kind of look, who start to look ugly and old and gray and, crooked, and we don't value that because we don't look for the inner beauty that they are perhaps growing. And how do we focus on that now, in whatever stage of life we're in?
Thank you. Thank you. Some really interesting thoughts. And I invite you to be a practicing philosopher and to continue this conversation with yourself, and to see what it gives birth to as you lean into a relationship with death. We're going to start talking about Plato now. And I guess one of the things that we need to talk about if we want to understand Plato is the death of Socrates. We can't actually start with Plato until we talk about another death. So Socrates was one of Plato's teachers and had a massive impact, not just on Plato's thinking, but also the direction of his philosophical endeavors. So Socrates really did not come up with massive amounts of theory, but Socrates developed the practice of Socratic dialogue. And his big question was always, why are people so susceptible to bullshit? Basically, how do we help ourselves be in conversation with what is real, rather than just with what is most in our faces, salient? That's a word we'll use quite a bit today. And so he went into Athens, in the democracy of Athens, and started many dialogues. And in those dialogues, the Socratic method was to keep asking questions that help people connect to their motivations and their reasons for thinking what they're thinking. So there's an interesting point as well, if you think about the Enneagram, and part of its purpose is to help us understand our motivations better. But in the Socratic dialogue, he upset quite a number of people, because basically he made some people who would like to think of themselves as wise and all-knowing kind of showed up some of their flawed thinking. So Socrates was, there were a number of different things that they said he was guilty of. The one was corrupting the youth. Isn't that wonderful? A philosopher corrupting the youth. I think that is something to be celebrated today. Philosophy as a form of corruption. And then also that he was not maintaining the belief in the gods that were part of the Athenian political system, and that he was introducing some new ideas around divinity. Those were the three main things that Socrates was charged with. Socrates was put to death. Plato was not there at the time at the hearing and everything. I think they made him drink hemlock, maybe. I think, yes. Okay, they made him drink hemlock and he died well before his main time on this earth was done. And this deeply affected Plato. So basically what it led Plato to ask is, how can my beloved Athena, because he loved Athens, he loved the city, he loved the democracy. How can beloved Athens put to death the wise and beloved Socrates? And a lot of his thinking was a conversation to try and make sense of the death of his teacher. Yeah? We'll look a little bit about Plato's allegory of the cave, we'll look at some of his other thoughts, but it's all this conversation. How did Athens get to do this thing that in many ways we can see as not wise, maybe in his thoughts even evil? How did this group of people manage to make this decision? So that's part of what we need to understand as we jump into this conversation, and why in Plato's Republic and a lot of his writings, he's writing dialogues and he's in dialogue with Socrates, even though Socrates is no longer alive. Yeah. So that's a lot of what he channeled in his writing. Now, what we're going to focus on today is we're going to focus on what Plato called the tripartite. The tripartite, that's a bad word in South Africa, but this is a Platonic word. But it's basically the alliance of the three things. He did not call them centers. Yeah. He did not call them centers, but this alliance of three things that makes humans humans. And the first part of this, if we want to use maybe some Enneagram language, we could say the first center of intelligence, or the first center, that he called the ruling part of the soul, was the head. And this is the part that represents reason. So the ability to not just think about things abstractly and understand abstraction, but it's the part of me that is most interested in what is true and to be in relationship with truth, and to kind of in some way through my reasoning be able to identify what is false. It's the part of me that enables long-term scope, and what it gifts me as a human being, this human part, this reasoning part, is it gifts me with understanding. Yeah. So up to now, we're fairly familiar, I think, with this kind of thinking. It's not just Plato that spoke about this. Gurdjieff spoke about that. We speak about this in the centers, even in neuroscience. There's some of these ideas around the mammalian brain and the reptilian brain, and the prefrontal cortex and all of those things. So there's many ways in which Plato's thoughts have been replicated through theory and through other ways of practice. So he called this first center the center of man. I am using the language of human. Remember, in Athens, only the men could vote. So I couldn't just write man. I had to go human. That was just me. Then the second part that he says we're in conversation with is the monster. Now, the monster, and here is represented by the gut and the genitals in some of Plato's thinking. And it's really the place that our appetite or our biological instinctual drive towards pleasure and the avoidance of pain comes from. And the monster is a very in the here and now part of ourselves. It's like immediate, this is scary, run away. I want this thing, I'm going to have it. It's that kind of thinking. So already in adult development theory, you can start seeing the links to maybe some early stages of adult development. As a mother of teenagers, maybe maybe I have new understanding of who's in charge in their lives right now. It's the monster. And the monster side of me is really not that interested in deep thinking, figuring things out, understanding the properties of things. It's very superficial. Is this scary? Is this yummy? Should I go for this? Should I not? Do I need to run away? So very superficial properties. And and there's nothing wrong with this. Without the monster, we would have all died out long before we were able to build sophisticated human societies like cities. We would all have died on the African savannah many years ago. Part of the purpose of the monster is to bring things into salience, to bring it into sharp focus, and to put it on, to use neuroscience terminology, to put it on my stage and to make it important for me. So we've got the human and we've got the monster. Now let's see how these two interact with each other, and we can use a little bit of an analogy. So let's say that I am aware of the fact that I need to lose weight. Yeah. And so I can use my human rational brain to understand what are some of the strategies that I might follow to that. It can help me figure out that eating that chocolate cake or eating that large portion of food or whatever it is, that's not good for me, right? The brain can do all of these things, my rational human self. And then I get home and there's a chocolate cake on the table and it's yummy and it's full of chocolatey. And then the monster part of me says, you have to have the chocolate cake right now, you know. And I know my rational self can say, yeah, that's not a good idea. It's just before lunch. Do you know how many calories that is? Like whatever. But the monster just go, yummy now. I'm going to have it. And that's the same way we get to make interesting decisions, right? We know we need to prepare for an important project. And then something jumps into focus as an opportunity. Someone phones and they say, you know, do you want to go for a quick run? And I go, yeah, I want to go for a quick run, whatever it is. But even though there's a big deadline looming, there's just something that pulls me away. And that's the conversation between the human rational side and the monster instinctual side. And that's not all we are, right? So there are other things that are in play here. So we're going to figure out what might be the other things in play. Just as a point of pause here in the conversation between the monster and the man, the monster and the human, this helps us to understand in many ways why salience trumps understanding, why sometimes the things that jump into sharp focus, or even we can use old language from Stephen Covey, why the urgent trumps the important so often. Because salience, and that's part of what the monster does, is it helps me to experience things as salient, and therefore keeps me safe. So salience trumps understanding because it's in the here and now. What happens when salience trumps understanding all the time? Now, two things happen. The first is it's very easy to bullshit us. Yeah. All you have to do is you have to make things salient. And my prefrontal cortex goes, okay, I need this. And that's advertising, a whole lot of things is based on that principle. That's why they maybe they do that less now in the Me Too times, but like put sexy girls in skimpy clothes on cars. Make the car more salient by evoking my monster in some kind of way, or in online advertising, just, make it flash and add some luminescent colors and it goes salient, and somehow my rational part of my brain is not engaged as it is. So that's the first part. It makes me more susceptible to some of the external stuff that if my reasoning was in play, I would not be falling prey to. Second thing that it does is it creates opportunities for self-deception. Now, self-deception is when I use my defense mechanisms to make up a story about why it's good for me to follow my instincts rather than to, and sometimes it is good to follow my instincts. I don't want to make the instincts bad, but like, okay, the monster trumped here, and I can use all my defense mechanisms to make up a story that goes, I really needed this. I really needed that chocolate. I really, I feel so much better now that dopamine hit. It's going to get me through the day. And do the same with a glass of wine at the end of a hard day, right? You can use self-deception to push an agenda that keeps you from relationship with reality. That would be Plato's words for that. Okay. So that's part of why we need to think about this conversation between the head and the gut. So what then also happens, I'll just talk about this for a moment. So this is not Plato, but part of what we experience is, and it's called hyperbolic discounting, is that the further into the future an event is likely to be, the harder it is to keep that event, that thing, as salient, like on the agenda. And the further into the future that is, the more natural it is for my brain to say, okay, there might be a lion in the room 10 weeks from now. You don't have to run now, right? And this also interferes in our relationship between the right use of the monster and our relationship with the rational self. So think about this for a moment. Our rational selves will tell most of us at this point in time that from an ecological perspective, really bad things are happening and are going to continue to happen in terms of the extinction of animals, in terms of rising sea levels as a result, so that whole climate change debate, we can have a rational conversation about it. If where you are sitting right now, the prediction is that the rising sea levels are probably only going to flood where you live 20 years from now, it is much harder to use that instinctual energy and to remain in a salient conversation with that than if it were to happen tomorrow. Yeah. So part of what's happening in the way in which we're busy with self-deception and maybe disappointing ourselves over and over again is, okay, that thing where we all run out of clean drinking water, it's going to happen. We can see some signs of it happening, but it's not going to happen this year. It might, well, some parts where Rand water gives you water, maybe it is happening right now, but we can push it out on the agenda. And so when I open the tap, I don't pay attention to how many liters of water running out into the sink for me to wash one glass, because that big thing is very far off and we can keep pushing it aside. So we're kind of getting back to the conversation with death. If death is very, very far, it's like that thing that will happen and it's far away, then some of the conversations around the ideal form, so this is what Plato spoke a lot about. He said it's useful to have a conversation with the ideal form because it helps to give us an inner landscape for what we want to aspire to. Aristotle, who followed, said that kind of stuff's not so good. You need to just work with the senses. But Plato was very idealistic. So he would say, think about the kind of life that you want to live. Yeah. And you will make that more salient by also thinking about death and living in closer relationship with death. And then you can be in conversation with this ideal form. And in the Enneagram, we might call that the virtues. We might call that the holy ideas. We might, there's many things that we can use in the Enneagram that gives us this idea of the ideal form that can inform the conversation between man and monster. So that's the first bit. What's the missing part in this? Now, interestingly, Plato did not call it the feeling center. He did not call it emotions. Plato called the part that was missing that did live in, that he says lives in the chest, actually the socio-cultural center. Yeah, it's that part of me that has to do and is informed by how I am in relation to other people and to my culture and my society. And part of what lives here in the chest is things like pride and shame and honor. You see, all of those things are kind of chest experiences because it has to do with how I relate to the society that I am in. Now, and this is the part that drives the desire for shared experiences. Now, John Vervaeke has this beautiful example, which I've seen in my life as well, that I'll share with you here. He says, this is the part of me that makes me want to share experiences with people around me. So if I'm eating something I don't know for the first time, and it's awful, I eat it, it's like, it's the part of me that goes, this is absolutely disgusting, have some. And we do this, right? I've done this, like, oh, this milk is off. Do you think so? You know, so it's like this part of me that drives the shared experience. Now, he called this part the lion, okay? Hence my Lion King theme. So it's the social cultural self. It lives in the chest. It's how I am in relation to my peers, to my culture, my society. And it's the place where we make meaning from shared cultural experiences. The word that Plato used for this is thymos. And thymos is sometimes translated as feelings, but the closest English translation for this is actually spirit, or the spirited part of me. Yeah. So the spirited part, so it's not the ghost spirits. I know there's like Samhain and Halloween at the moment, not that kind of spirit, but the spirited part of me that infuses things with my life, and the spiritedness of my heart. And this is the part where through my relationship with others and distributed cognition and distributed norms and distributed meaning, so it's not just living in me, but living in the larger society as well, I'm able to build a relationship between the monster and the man. And it's the place where I can do some intermediate scope. Okay, I want the chocolate cake, but there's a whole family here. So maybe we can share the chocolate cake for dessert after our supper, as opposed to me just going, you know, can you see it's already being an intermediary between the thinking self and the more gut-oriented self. So that's the lion. And the reason why Plato chose the lion for this is because lions live in prides. Yeah. So not only do they bring a certain spirit to it, but they are cultural animals. You know, they group animals, not quite herding in the same way that horses are herders, but they belong in a group together, and it's the orientation of me in the group that keeps things in check. So Plato created this tripartite version of what drives us. There's the man, there's the monster, there's the lion. And then his thinking from there was, okay, in order for us to live a good life, yeah, we need to get the relationship between these three ordered. What happens if it's in disorder and disarray is that salience, so the gut, understanding, the head, and participation, the thymos, are out of sync with each other. And when they're out of sync with each other, we're more susceptible to bullshit, and we're more susceptible to self-deception. And that's part of what keeps us, now let's use some Enneagram language here, stuck in the passions at earlier stages of integration. Yeah, that I don't have the right order between these three. Now, I'm wondering who's thinking of Gurdjieff right now, because when I first started engaging with this, I was thinking of Gurdjieff. What did Gurdjieff call some of his teachings? He called it the fourth way, because the fourth way is where my three centers are in right relationship with each other, and I am in the higher expression of each of these centers. I'm not in the, lower expression of the head center energy, which can be monkey mind and just thoughts all over the place. I'm in the place where my thoughts are ordered and centered. My gut center is grounded instead of a monster, and my heart center is open and participative, as opposed to being a hungry and a challenged heart. Yeah. So Gurdjieff's teachings of I am here now, and a lot of his movement practices and different things that he did, was all about establishing the right order between the three centers. So that's where also Gurdjieff, Plato, they're singing off a very similar hymn sheet. Now, part of what Plato said, and this kind of language was used by Gurdjieff as well, is that part of my job as the human living inside with the man, the monster, and the lion, is to give each the food and motion which are natural to it. What is the food and motion that is natural to the head, the gut, and the thymos, the lion? And what Gurdjieff said then very specifically is the higher blends with the lower to actualize the middle. So I need to figure out how the head and the gut can be in right relationship with each other so that my participation in the world can be actualized. So Plato had some interesting thoughts around how you do this. How do you create this order to avoid the inner conflict between the three centers? So he said it all starts with teaching the man. So the head center needs to be taught. That's its natural food. Its natural motion is to teach and to be in conversation with knowledge, to build an understanding about the theory that is in play, to get the facts. That's the natural food of man. And we do this to train the lion. So that is our socio-cultural self. So our knowledge and our theories and our facts that we're getting, we're using that to train the lion. So we take reason into the social arena, and we do that through dialogue. And in dialogue, which is the Socratic method, we bring together the relational and the rational. And when we can do that, we can tame the monster. We can't kill the monster. We need the monster. Without the monster, we would die. So we need the monster. There's good in the monster. We just don't want the monster to be running amok and running the show. And that's what Plato called wisdom. He said it's internal justice in the psyche between these three things, and that minimizes internal conflict. So in many ways, he's talking about an optimization strategy. What is the optimal relationship between man, lion, and monster, where each can live a healthy, mutual existence? And then Plato used words like saying, this is the fullness of being. And this is what it really means to be at peace with myself. And being at peace with myself is one of the meta drives of man. And that's really, I want to be able to have my needs met without my three centers being in conflict. And what we can also say is it's not an optimization strategy if any of them is ruling in a form of tyranny. Yeah, the monster in charge is as dangerous as just the man, the rational self that's in charge without the right relationship between all three of them. So I'm going to pause there because I've said quite a lot. And I'm just going to say, so ask what's bubbling up? What are your thoughts? How are you connecting it to Enneagram, adult development theory? What's floating around for you right now? And play with me, you know.
So firstly, if I can say something, I just want to thank you for doing such an incredible job of synthesizing so many ideas and bringing it together in the way that you have. It's phenomenal. And I wouldn't want to respond to any of the content yet, just to say that straight up. Thank you.
Thanks, Ingrid. I mean, I'm playing with ideas in my mind, like, you know, that thing where we have a body, you know, and our bodies are just used as tools to serve our relationships, what we do in the world, and our thinking. Can you see how when I'm having a body, instead of being in right relationship with it, part of what I'm doing is that the monster is not in right relationship with the others. And so therefore it becomes quite dangerous, because it can jump on me like a tiger when I'm least expecting it, because I'm not in a conscious relationship with it. And it can also mean that because I'm not taking care of it, the other two fall over, because, you know, the monster is the most salient. And when the monster, you know, I can feel that today. I'm not feeling great. I'm not in tip-top health. So that part of me, the body part of me, is very salient. And it's much harder to stay in any of the other centers. So we're starting to think in those kinds of ways, which I know is, you know, that's part of how we think in the Enneagram world. But maybe it gives us some thoughts and ideas of where it comes from. Jo?
So I agree with just the brilliant way that you've explained this. I'm just making copious notes here because I'm just loving the concepts and this whole man, lion, monster balance. I'm curious around what's written about the how. So, you know, it's kind of an ongoing struggle as how we do this, and, you know, why we just get it wrong so much of the time. Yeah. And how one kind of constantly gets that balance to get to that, what we aspire to, I think, is that being the fullness of being and the at peace with myself.
Yeah.
I'm curious about that.
I think part of what I understand Plato's main methods into that would be, first is to work with these three verbs in many ways. And that has to do with teach, train, and tame. What do I need to teach myself? What do I need to train? Where do I need to train the way in which I show up? What do I need to tame in me? And part of that's a helpful guiding light. The second part that he definitely worked on is, he said, the middle part, the thymos, the socio-cultural, is part of what enables the rest. So if I go all hermit on myself, or I'm just in conversation in my own head about what this all means, then I'm missing out on the socio-cultural aspect that enables me to get this balance right better. And the principles that are in play here is like, what do most of the weight loss programs that really work have in common? They put you in contact with other human beings. So you join Weight Watchers and you're in conversation with others. So the method of the Socratic dialogue and being in conversation and being in the relational is, for Plato, a significant part of what helps me with the right relationship between all three of them. Yeah. So that's maybe in part, it explains part of therapy and coaching and group-based leadership development work, and the way in which communities of practice offer us the opportunity to get out of the individual conversation, the hermetic conversation, and to get invested in a different way because I'm relating to the group in some kind of way. And I think in part in adult development theory, why we go through this flow of I'm getting into the group and then I'm slightly more out of the group again, I'm separating out, then I need the group again. Otherwise, that's not sustainable. So this move of in and out of group, in and out of community is part of what one does there. And then the third thing that Plato works with a lot is this idea of the ideal form, and investing in creating an inner world that enables me to have some hooks around what the ideal is like. But the ideal world, as we know, if we build an ideal world that's too utopic, then actually we're shutting down the thymos as well, because it creates shame. I'm never going to get there. My ideal is I must be fit into a size 6 dress. Now, that's never going to happen for me. So that's actually shutting down my relationship with my sociocultural self. So to think about what the ideal forms are that support this. Very theoretical. I wish we could have Plato here in a Socratic dialogue and to hear how he would answer that. Kate?
Yeah, Lucille, I'm finding this so interesting. And there are two particular threads that are coming through for me, and I'm sort of trying to make sense of them. And those threads are both around starting with the body. So the monster. And last week, we did a movement session with a team with Christo's support to really tap into the body as a way to tap into the heart and then to elevate the mind. And it's a similar thread that I'm experiencing on the neuroscience of change. So the Coach's Rising course that I'm currently on, they're talking about the body as the brain. So, and the emotions, so like Plato, they're saying emotions is the sort of the bridging part, the bridging between the body as the brain, the interoception, the exteroception, the senses, all those aspects. And that the sort of the conceptual thinking, the rational, which is where we've probably mostly spent a lot of time when we're coaching, it's starting to bridge. The emotions bridge it, but they are also inviting in, like, start with the body, like really explore the body and then come to the emotion and then make more sense rather than the other way around. So I'm trying to make sense because Plato's suggesting the other way, right?
No, not necessarily. I think
is that not in that order? Is that not
No.
teach the man, train the lion? No. Okay, am I misunderstanding?
I think you can do it in any order, but it's to know what the operative term is for that. One of the things that Gurdjieff would say into that is the way in which you do that is through presence. So presence-based coaching. And that's an interesting place because it's part somatic, part practice. It's many things, but Gurdjieff's thoughts around this is that being present is part of what allows that. My question to you would be, Kate, when you did the movement to connect to the heart in a group that works very exclusively in the head, how did that work for the group? What did you see when you tried this out?
A lot of discomfort, a lot of laughing to push away the discomfort. And then eventually some jumping into it and a lot of fun and people accessing new parts of themselves that I don't think they really have in the context of in a work context. So it sort of it enlivened the room until we started having Enneagram 7 saying, I'm done with this. I've done enough dancing. I want to move on. And, we had those sort of things starting to play out, but certainly enlivened and opened up, more aspects of people. Yeah. In a team that's very rational, IT leadership team, very rational. Yeah.
Beautiful. Like it. But also interesting to just note the tolerance. The tolerance levels, how much can we work with the body in a group where my relationship with the monster is maybe a blind spot? Or as Russ always says, my life is a temple to my instincts, but I don't see it. I don't see the way in which I've built that temple. So if I'm wanting to look in there, I might need to build up tolerance over time in some kind of way, especially if it puts me into relationship with pain and discomfort, which is part of what the monster does, is like minimize pain, overlay some other things into that. So let's just see where we're at. So I think what I'm going to do is I want to bring another part of the conversation in, and in particular here, I want to bring us into conversation with the myth of Plato's cave. Just bring that into the conversation as well. So let's just bridge that for a moment. The story that Plato tells is, he says, we have to appeal to the fullness of being in dialogue. So this is this ideal self, to the ideals of what our life could be through dialogue. And he says the way in which this process happens is a process of participatory knowing. So as my centers, using that word for now, come into right relationship with each other, the amount of inner conflict I'm experiencing goes down. And as that inner conflict goes down, I'm less susceptible to self-deception. I'm less deceptive to bullshit. So that helps me to be more in touch with the real patterns. It's almost like there's a film over my lenses that gets removed and the world reveals itself to me a little bit more. I get more in touch with realness, what's really happening out there through all three centers, not just through the head, but through all of that. And as I'm more in relationship with realness, it offers me some new ideals, it offers me skills, it offers me a new relationship with how I am in the world. And if I apply those things inward into myself, I'm able to see myself better. I'm not just able to see the world better, I can see myself better as well. So better knowledge of the self. And I can use this knowledge to teach the man, to train the lion, to tame the monster. And as I do this, my inner conflict goes down even more. And as my inner conflict goes down, I get more in touch with realness. And this is almost like the adult development story, right? I think I see the whole world, then I get in touch with more of the world. I need to figure out how to integrate that into my being. And as I do that, I'm able to see more of the world, and the cycle repeats, the cycle of participatory knowing that Plato speaks of so much. And of course, this is what Gurdjieff would have said, gets us into conversation with the higher aspects of each of the centers as we're in this participatory knowing process. And Gurdjieff had all those wonderful ways of doing it through movement, through teaching in very tricksy ways, like hiding teachings deep inside work. You know, it's a way of training the mind to go and find things. So lots of interesting things that Gurdjieff did for that. So I'm not going to do this right now. I'm going to get us to watch a short video. And it is about another part of Plato's teaching, which is teaching through the myth of Plato's cave. So let me just, I'm not sure if I've got it optimized for video. No, I don't. So I do now.
What is reality? Knowledge? The meaning of life? Big topics you might tackle figuratively, explaining existence as a journey down a road or across an ocean, a climb, a war, a book, a thread, a game, a window of opportunity, or an all too short-lived flicker of flame. 2,400 years ago, one of history's most famous thinkers said life is like being chained up in a cave, forced to watch shadows flitting across a stone wall. Pretty cheery, right? That's actually what Plato suggested in his Allegory of the Cave, found in Book 7 of the Republic, in which the Greek philosopher envisioned the ideal society by examining concepts like justice, truth, and beauty. In the allegory, a group of prisoners have been confined in a cavern since birth with no knowledge of the outside world. They are chained facing a wall, unable to turn their heads, while a fire behind them gives off a faint light. Occasionally, people pass by the fire carrying figures of animals and other objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners name and classify these illusions, believing they're perceiving actual entities. Suddenly, one prisoner is freed and brought outside for the first time. The sunlight hurts his eyes, and he finds the new environment disorienting. When told that the things around him are real, while the shadows were mere reflections, he cannot believe it. The shadows appeared much clearer to him, but gradually his eyes adjust until he can look at reflections in the water, at objects directly, and finally at the sun. whose light is the ultimate source of everything he has seen. The prisoner returns to the cave to share his discovery, but he is no longer used to the darkness and has a hard time seeing the shadows on the wall. The other prisoners think the journey has made him stupid and blind and violently resist any attempts to free them. Plato introduces this passage as an analogy of what it's like to be a philosopher trying to educate the public. Most people are not just comfortable in their ignorance, but hostile to anyone who points it out. In fact, the real-life Socrates was sentenced to death by the Athenian government for disrupting the social order, and his student Plato spends much of the Republic disparaging Athenian democracy, while promoting rule by philosopher kings. With the cave parable, Plato may be arguing that the masses are too stubborn and ignorant to govern themselves. But the allegory has captured imaginations for 2,400 years because it can be read in far more ways. Importantly, the allegory is connected to the theory of forms developed in Plato's other dialogues, which holds that, like the shadows on the wall, things in the physical world are flawed reflections of ideal forms, such as roundness or beauty. In this way, the cave leads to many fundamental questions, including the origin of knowledge, the problem of representation, and the nature of reality itself. For theologians, the ideal forms exist in the mind of a creator. For philosophers of language viewing the forms as linguistic concepts, the theory illustrates the problem of grouping concrete things under abstract terms. And others still wonder whether we can really know that the things outside the cave are any more real than the shadows. As we go about our lives, can we be confident in what we think we know? Perhaps one day a glimmer of light may punch a hole in your most basic assumptions. Will you break free to struggle towards the light, even if it costs you your friends and family? Or stick with comfortable and familiar illusions? Truth or habit? Light or shadow? Hard choices, but if it's any consolation, you're not alone. There are lots of us down here.
So, in the way in which the allegory, the myth of Plato's cave is told, as this man that is freed moves towards the surface, there's this process, and the process goes, I move a little bit closer to the surface and the bright light that's out there. And then I'm blinded by it, and I have to stop until I've adjusted to that. And then I move a little bit further. And so I can't just go out of the cave into the bright light in one big go, because that might actually, and then look at the sun. I mean, that will actually blind me if I've spent my whole life in the cave. But it is this process of gradually accustoming myself to that. And then the big question that is there, how do I take the story of what is real and what I'm now aware is real back to people that don't know that that's real yet? And that's, of course, the conversation around what happened to Socrates at one level. But there's many questions around how we work back into systems of meaning and understanding. Yeah, any thoughts or comments on this idea of Plato's cave? Anything that came up for you as you were listening to that?
One thing I sometimes wonder about is that prisoner that suddenly became free. It's also possible that somebody put some hallucinogenic in his food, and he did not really become free, but created a whole world that he's trying to share with other people.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering about ways how to distinguish between those two experiences.
What's really real and what's just another illusion? Yeah. That's a really big question. I guess Aristotle would have said that the way in which you distinguish between those is through the senses. And I know that, a hallucinogenic, if we use that further, distorts the senses, which is what makes it quite tricky. But Aristotle's main argument, which was kind of the next part of this chapter, is go back to the senses and what you can see and feel in the world, because the more of a sensory experience you can have with that thing, the more real it becomes. And then who is to say that, when we do another loop with this, Rikus, who is to say that the hallucinatory is not more real than the other? I don't know. Naughty looping. In
that piece of William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, where he writes about if only the doors of perception were cleansed. You know that passage, if only the doors of perception were cleansed, we would see everything as it is, infinite. But now man looks at the world through narrow chinks in his cabin. But before that, there's a very interesting line. And he speaks about the refinement of sensual experience that needs to take place to get us to that point. So I read it this morning. I thought, that's very interesting. I never saw that little piece about the sensual experience that needs to be refined. And then he speaks about that leads to the cleansing of perception.
And I mean, Gurdjieff writes quite a lot about tapping into the cosmic energy, the oneness as well, which might be something around the cleansed doors of perception. Karen, you wanted to say or ask something.
Yeah, so what I thought also was quite interesting is how, and this is often what we come up with coaching, is that sometimes it's your circle, your closest circle, that actually resists that change that you're experiencing. So, coming back to try and explain that or taking it through in order to try and make sense of the three, to align the three centers. One big part of that is, as you said, the support or the social aspect of it.
Yeah.
That is often where the journey gets slowed down, because it's uncomfortable to feel somebody that is in close relationship with you changing.
And I mean, if you think about that story, is it really possible to explain to the people in the cave what the world out there is like? Or is it that we need to figure out a way to unchain those people too and take them slowly into the outer world? That thing of like, what I experience is different to what I'm told. And I think sometimes what happens for us is we go through some kind of shift in our consciousness, our way of seeing the world, and we go back and we tell people about it. And telling is useful, but it's not going to take us as far as when we show people that.
That's so true. Yeah.
So some of my thoughts around just that wonderful myth, and myth is something that helps me make more meaning. So this is a myth about self-transcendence and coming into greater and greater contact with reality. Being in relationship with the real patterns blind me, and then I integrate them. And I take another step towards the surface, another step towards the surface, another step towards the surface. And as I come into contact with more and more reality, I become more and more alive and experience more and more meaning. And the interesting thing that this does is it brings two parts of the meta drives so Plato spoke a lot about the meta drives of humanity. One of the meta drives is that experience of being at peace with myself. Another meta drive was being in contact with reality. Yeah, our deeper desire to be in contact with reality. And I'll borrow from John Vervaeke again, like a thought experiment that you can do around what it means to be in contact with reality. So you can ask the question to a group such as all of you, who of you are at this point in time in happy, life-giving, mutually supportive relationships, right? You can put up your hand. And then if you ask the next question, and who of you would want to know if your partner were cheating on you? Even if it means that might shift the nature of that relationship. Vast majority of people say, I would want to know. And so the purpose of that thought experiment is to say there's a meta drive, even when there are things that are really precious to our lives, there's a broader drive through that towards the desire to be in touch with reality, which is as strong as the desire to be at peace with myself, to not have this conflict between the centers playing out. Yeah. Now, we might say that that is a very old, 2,400-year-old myth. Is this really relevant to us? What's a modern version of the telling of this myth? Something like the movie The Matrix? Yeah. So The Matrix is a modern version of Plato's cave. That idea that Neo is in the dream, he's seeing the shadows of the, on the wall. He thinks that that's real. Do you want to take the blue pill or the red pill? And I'm awakening into this harsh reality that is very hard to navigate at the start. And systematically, I'm able to navigate that more and more and more, and then come back to go and wake up the rest of the world. And the world says, I'm not so sure. I want to be woken up. So the Matrix, that the salience of that myth, even though Plato wrote it 2,400 years ago, is still true and valid for us in the here and now, because people flock to see a movie that has the same kind of meta story to that as Plato's myth. So in terms of what I'm going to ask us to do is we're going to do a breakout. And our last breakout for the day, I'll put you in new groups. And the question to answer is, what does this myth, Plato's cave, what does this mean in my life today? What is it saying to me and my life? And my experience of my world, my work, my relationships, whatever comes up for you. What does the myth of Plato's cave mean in your life today? So let me pop that question into the chat box so you have it to go back to. And then I'm going to pop you into breakout rooms just for, let's do a kind of a 15-minute breakout again. I'm running out of steam. I can't navigate Zoom anymore. Okay. Breakout rooms. Yeah, I think you're in different ones. See you in a while. Here they come. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back from that. And so from the man to the monster to the lion and into Plato's cave and the ideal forms, I'd love to invite a couple of people to just share some closing thoughts before we finish off our session for today. Yeah, so what's up for you? What are you thinking? How's this in conversation with Enneagram, vertical development theory? What's happening for you? Anything you want to share?
Something Anne mentioned just towards the end of our conversation about the social, what's the social center, the themos, the thymos, which is an interesting center, and you were quite disappointed with it in some way, and you could speak to it yourself. But there's a contemporary philosopher, Peter Sloterdijk, who wrote a whole book. The book's name is Rage, and it speaks about a themotic economy. And where Freud and then Freud through Lacan, etc., speaks of this libidinal economy, and they focused on the libidinal economy. Sloterdijk speaks of the themos as as also an economy of affect, and that rage is one of the key expressions of that. And in our context, when people are becoming without effect, etc. There's this disaffectedness in the world, especially among people without any vision of the future. That rage element becomes really important. This idea of the thematic economy, and what do you do with those thematic energies, which can be harnessed for revolution, etc. So he develops the whole idea of the thematic, which I thought was really, really interesting, reading on from Plato through Freud, etc.
Yeah, well, Plato actually also wrote about rage living in that center very directly, saying the only way in which we're able to respond to injustice when that's part of the reality that we meet is through the rage that we experience in this chest center in the thymus.
Yeah. That's how he in his scheme of aristocracy, democracy, etc. It was his way to bring the warriors into his philosopher kingdom, so that they can have dignity and they have this role of protecting the city-state.
That's a beautiful question, and the question is how do we bring the warriors and maybe some other people that can easily be left out of the ecosystem, how do we bring them in? It's interesting. Thanks. And do you want to follow on that? Is there anything you want to say? Okay, good. Anyone else? What's stirring for you? What's up? Ingrid.
So what I like about the way that you've done this is that you've kind of not gone the full Neoplatonism in the Enneagram. You know, that like Mario Sikора's big objection to that whole way of thinking is that it's Neoplatonic, that there's a separation between actual life and ideal forms, and there's this essence versus ego. And the way that you've presented this, you haven't mentioned the word essence and transcending these elements of our being, that it's integrated in the here and now in our real lived human experience. So you can still use Platonic ideas without making this essence versus ego split. So that's what I really appreciate about what you've done. So I don't know if there's anything that you can say about that, because I would imagine that it's deliberate.
Yeah, that is quite deliberate, because I think that is, and it is in where we are in conversation as Aephoria with adult development theory and a more existential approach as well, is how can we very deliberately move away from that split between essence and ego and say we are always becoming, we are always emerging from the cave, is a lot more useful than to reify those aspects of self. So yeah, absolutely.
Great, that's helpful to frame it in existential terms. Yeah, that's really nice, thanks.
Let's have one last comment and then we're going to close up for the day. Anything else that's stirring, whether profound, whether sacred or profane? Confused or clear?
Lucille, we had quite a fun conversation in our group about the cave and shadows. And we kind of explored it initially quite gingerly, trying to work out what it meant, and got to a point, I think, where the bit that I used was journalism, which is my field, which is that when you go out on a story, it can be a very simple story like a crime or a car accident. And you think the story is one thing and you get there and it starts turning into something else. And so that in the end, you're always only ever dealing with a version of the world and of reality. But we ended in a more interesting place, I thought, which was where, so at what point is the people looking at the shadows just ignorance? Like, Like, so, you know, you can go so far and go like, we've all got, and maybe this is, I don't know, in philosophical terms, maybe this is why he poses this image, because I sort of started thinking of Trump supporters. Like, what is that version of reality? And is it okay? Is it okay just to see the shadows, or is it not okay? Should we slap them around a bit and make them see that there are other realities? And that's one's instinct. Well, mine is to go like, so, you know, so we can't live in the grayness of constantly going, oh, the world is kind of, we're constantly evolving and emerging. We actually have to have some things that we think and that hold us, and that we say, no, that isn't reality.
Yeah,
but we know that it is for them. But are they just stupid? Is my I don't know. so that's where we landed up.
Yeah, sounds like it was a very interesting conversation, Adam. And I mean, part of what I would do to just offer some thought into where your group landed there is to always think of what is the implication of my, you know, me being in relationship with just, you know, my version of reality, the shadows on the wall. What's the larger implication? So it's once again to bring in the socio-cultural, broader than the socio-cultural of just the Trump supporters, if we use that as an analogy, but say, what's the implication of the larger world, for the larger world, if we acquiesce to the request to leave us watching the shadows on the wall? Yeah. What's the implication of that? What's the implication of that for, and so I think that's the socio-political element, which is part of Plato's thinking as well, the ideal form, where we're going in some kind of way. But for our children's children, if we just leave this be, and we can use a South African example for this too, if we all just sat back and said, okay, like apartheid is like just shadows on the wall, and people should just stay there watching the shadows on the wall. I mean, that has certain moral, ethical implications. And that idea of the ideal form next to that propels me into the rage. So we full circle into the rage for the broader social-cultural implications of that. And the rage is what helps me meet injustice. And it evokes the warrior archetype. So if your warrior archetype has been evoked, Plato would probably say, yes, you're tuning into the lion. What does the lion need? What is the lion's food? How do you keep the lion healthy and in relation with the monster and the man? So if that means that we now go and blow up the next Trump rally, that's maybe the monster taking over, although it could be tempting from a certain socio-political perspective.
You've always told me I need to be more in touch with my anger and rage. So maybe this is my moment.
Yeah, who knows? Who knows, Adam? It's the large awakening of the lion. So in laughter yoga, there is a way in which we connect to lion energy. And you show your claws, and then you open your mouth really wide. I'll show you what it looks like. And you stick out your tongue and you roll your eyes up, and it actually stimulates the thyroid gland and a lot of other things. And then you laugh like a lion. And so this will be my checkout for everyone. Okay, great. Have a beautiful day. Thanks so much for coming to Supervision. Bye.
Thank you. It was really lovely.
Thank you, Lucille.
Thanks,
Thank you, Lucille.